Jessica has always lived between the world of reality and the worlds of her fantasies. As a child, she lacked warmth and care. Her father had left the family when she was 6. Her mother had fallen into her own darkness. Jessica was often alone with herself, trapped in an old house where every creak of the floorboards felt like someone's footsteps. She heard voices, saw shadows that moved when she turned away. No one believed her, blaming her fears on her imagination. At school, Jessica was a quiet girl, sitting long hours in the library, absorbing other people's stories, forgetting her own. She lived in a world of fictional heroes and monsters that seemed more real than the people around her. But the shadows didn't leave her even there. They followed her, whispering to her that she was alone, that her world would never be normal. Things got worse when she turned 23. After a nervous breakdown that caused her to cut herself with mirror shards, Jessica was institutionalized in a mental institution. She was there for almost 2 years. The endless white walls, the monotonous faces of the doctors, the rustles in the silence of the night, all of it consumed her mind. She forgot what day it was, lost in her thoughts, and increasingly believed she would never leave that place. When her husband Paul took her home, Jessica was never the same. But he loved her, nursed her patiently, tried to convince her that it was all just a trace of her illness and that they would be together now, away from all this horror. But Jessica knew the house they'd moved into wasn't just a house either. It was something more, something sinister. And now, months later, she was beginning to notice the walls breathing, the shadows beginning. What? The rain was especially cold and heavy tonight, falling on the old windows of the house with a thud, merging with the fog outside. Jessica sat on the couch, tired and exhausted. The pages of the book in front of her were a blur, as were her thoughts. She tried to focus, but something was gnawing at her from the inside. Paul was in the kitchen, cooking dinner as always, but his footsteps, usually so crisp, seemed muffled today, as if something was crowding out the sounds. "Jess, are you okay?" Paul's voice came from the kitchen, his tone soft but with an undercurrent of concern. Jessica had long ago learned to hear that subtle tinge of anxiety. He felt it too, but didn't want to admit it. They were both afraid to admit that this house held them in its embrace. "Yeah, it's okay." She tried to answer confidently, but her voice shook. Her heart was beating too fast, as if something was about to happen. Outside the window, the wind suddenly picked up, causing tree branches to scrape against the glass. The shadows on the walls of the house began to move, and though Jessica tried to ignore them, they became more and more intrusive. She knew these shadows. They had come for her when she was a child. They whispered to her that she belonged to them. Paul came and sat next to her, gazing intently into her face. He had always been her support, but with each passing day she saw his concern turn to helplessness. "You know you're just imagining it, don't you?" His words sounded like he was trying to convince not only her, but himself as well. Jessica didn't answer. She looked out the window again. There, beyond the glass, something was moving. She was sure of it. A black figure stood at the edge of the woods, not moving, but watching them. She saw it every time it started to rain. "Paul," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "There's someone standing there." "No one's there," he said. But Jessica felt his hand tense in hers. "I've seen this before. When I was a kid. They were always there, and now they've come for me." Paul stood up, shaking his head unhappily. "You're seeing things again that aren't there. The house just seems strange to you because you think too much about your past." But Jessica knew that wasn't true. These figures were not part of her imagination. She knew the house was connected to them, to those who waited for her outside. She stood up and walked to the door, feeling her breathing quicken. Something was drawing her to this place, dark and uncharted. Paul tried to stop her, but she had already opened the door. The wind whipped across her face, rain running down her skin like a warm red liquid. She saw a figure move toward her. "No," she said, stepping back, but it was too late. The figure was at the very threshold. She saw it clearly now. It was a man, or what had once been a man. The face was distorted, as if its skin had merged with the shadows. "You always knew you'd come back, Jessica," came a voice, low and ominous. "We've been waiting for you. This is your true home here." "Oh." She froze, as if her feet were stuck to the floor. Paul rushed toward her, but as soon as his hands touched hers, he began to scream. His body contorted as if it had become a shadow, his face contorted in an agonizing grimace. "Paul," she screamed, but there was nothing she could do. His scream became muffled. The dark walls swallowed it up, as did the light, as did reality. He disappeared, vanished into the house, as if he had never existed. Jessica was left alone. The silence fell upon her with such force that it seemed to fill all her thoughts. She turned toward the figure that stood at the threshold. In that moment, she realized that it was not a shadow, not a ghost. It was her own fear, her past, her madness that had always lived inside her. "You can't escape, Jessica," the voice whispered, echoing in her head. "You've always been with us." Jessica ran for the stairs, her breath hitching, her feet frozen in the floor like quicksand. Every step was hard, but she knew she had to move, something screaming inside her survival instinct. But the house, as always, had a life of its own. The walls moved, the rustles grew louder. Each room shrank, as if space was shrinking to infinity. On the top floor, she noticed something strange, a door they had never opened. Paul claimed it had been boarded up since they moved in, but now it was ajar, and a dim light was pouring in from behind it. She stopped in front of it, shuddering, but the darkness behind her urged her forward. She stepped inside. It was the room of her childhood, the same room where she had heard whispers and seen shadows. And now she knew she had never left it. Her mind closed in. Everything became one big, endless nightmare. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but no one else heard her footsteps or her screams. And only the empty house, old and silent, remained to witness what had happened. Silence enveloped everything around. The rain no longer pounded on the windows as if the world had frozen, but anyone passing by this house would feel a strange, cold feeling as if someone was watching them.